at the moment. Moving on, because a report released by the Project Management Institute found Australia is worse than global average, wasting some $108 million for every billion spent on major projects. The Project Management Institute is an organisation that has helped train nearly 1 million people in project management skills right around the world. And here to talk about all of these issues plus more, Mark Langley, CEO and President of the Project Management Institute, joins us from our Sydney CBD studio. Mark Langley, really appreciate your time this morning. I thought if we could, we might start actually with the release itself, particularly as it relates to wastage when it comes to these huge projects. I note in the release that the world seems to be doing a little bit better, reducing money wasted by 20% compared to the previous year. But how do you define wastage? What are you talking about when you refer to wasting of money when it comes to these big projects?
Yeah, when we speak about wastage, we're really referring to budget lost in major projects and programs around the world. So budget lost due to poor project performance. When we see organizations that struggle with performance, on average, as you mentioned, it's roughly 10% of their budget. I think more importantly is when we look at those that are actually champions or high-performing organizations, the difference between the low end and the high performers waste 28 times less than low performers. Wow. So it's really, there's a premium. It pays to be good at project and program management. And
do you have any understanding or insights as to what separates the two? Like, what are the common issues that lead to wastage?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, the report gives insight into the practices that those that are excellent at project management have more often than those that are poor at project management. They include things like having a dedicated documented career path, so a career for project and program managers, just like they would any other profession, engineering, accountancy, and so on. And they have ongoing training and development so that they're preparing the workforce, those that are actually delivering major pieces of strategy through projects and programs for the next 3 to 5 years, making sure their skills and competencies are current for the future.
Mark, Julia Lee from Bell Direct. I'm just curious, it says Australia is worse than the average. Do you have any insight in what makes Australia worse than the average when it comes to project management and this wastage in terms of infrastructure?
Well, when we look at the data from the research, there's two actually that stand out where Australia lags the global average. The first is one I've already mentioned, which is defined documented career path. So they're less likely to have a formal career path for project and program managers, and also have the ongoing training and development. The other is what we call benefits realization, so maturity and benefits realization. So we don't do projects and programs because we're enamored with them. We do it because we want to receive something from them, the benefit ultimately. And when we call that benefits realization and maturity, and more often Australian organizations lag the global average in terms of benefits maturity.
Mark, it's Tony Davison from Henderson Maxwell here. It's interesting, is it to an extent this missing of the target, as you were, is it to an extent the scope and setting the scope right in the first place? And what I'm thinking about here is government agencies with well-intentioned outcomes perhaps making a too loose a scope or a set of thought bubbles that make it very difficult then to actually achieve an objective? Or is it really more about the methodology, which is what you're sort of talking about?
Well, it's a combination of factors. So the one thing I'd say is we actually changing organization priorities is the leading cause of project failure, both globally and also in Australia. And that brings in requirements, or scope, as you've called it, a common term for it. The other thing that we find as the number one success criteria, so if we look at what makes projects or programs more successful around the world and here in Australia, it's an engaged executive sponsor. So there's a role that leadership plays in the organization, whether it's public sector or private sector, in the execution and delivery of major programs. They have a significant role and have a significant impact on the success.
Mark, and I'm curious, do you find that ownership does make a difference, so public versus private ownership, and does that have anything behind why Australia may be behind the global average?
Well, it does. If there's, in private sector, they're more likely to have defined career paths and actually define the role of the sponsor. And the public sector, especially since the post-global financial crisis, is really catching up to the private sector. So they're bringing in private sector best practices, establishing career paths within government. For instance, the European Union passed some regulation in the CPR a couple of years ago. The United States just passed law, and President Obama signed it into action in December of last year, establishing career paths in those roles, and including executives and the role that the executive plays. So what is my role as sponsor? And if I don't know my role, then we can be assured that we're less effective in it.
Just in regards to the US, Mark, obviously one of the foundation stones of the campaign, and what we've heard through recent times from US President Donald Trump is planned infrastructure spend. Your thoughts around what you're hearing, the likely success of implementation, and I suppose, yeah, just your takeaways from what you've been hearing and expecting.
Yeah, well, we see some early signs that the infrastructure plan is still underway, and more importantly, the support for the legislation that went into place in December by President Obama. We already see an early action by President Trump, where he's appointed an assistant to the president focused on strategic projects. So there's a position that he's established in January that's going to be accountable for and overseeing the most strategic or significant investments, which would likely include many of the major infrastructure programs.
And from your perspective, is a lot of the planned infrastructure overdue?
Oh, I think in any country, certainly Western countries, there's always a need for investment in infrastructure, whether it's lagging because we've trailed in the past years or decades, but more importantly, it's around economic development and the role it can play in terms of generating economic development, GDP growth, and enabling, as I mentioned earlier, the next 3 to 5 or 10 years versus fixing the problems of the past.
All right, Mark Langley, look, wonderful to have you on the program this morning. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.